what do we see as the ideal place of the Shoah in Israeli society? Like, how should Israeli society relate to the Shoah? What significance does it have? How do we remember it? How do we relate to it? How should we relate to it on a diplomatic level? Meaning, right now, it's policy that whenever a foreign dignitary comes to our country, we take him to Yad Vashem. Like, that's somewhere he has to go. I don't know if that's productive or counterproductive. I think that's part of what we'll discuss. Do we see the state of Israel as something that resulted from the Holocaust? Or do we see the state of Israel as something that could have prevented the Holocaust had we established the state 10 years earlier? Meaning, how do we relate to how do we relate to it? How do we believe? What place does the Shoah have in Israeli society? That's the question.
So, I happen to think that is it's a very important topic to be discussed. There's so much that I can say on it, and I'm going to try to just share my views in very short format. I believe that the way the Holocaust is being discussed in Israeli society today, or at least has been discussed, is a little bit not productive, a little bit counterproductive. And I think that the symbolism of taking, I think that generally has been that the first place a dignitary has gone, in many cases at least, is right to Yad Vashem first. And I think that's counterproductive because what it gives the impression that we have this country over here in the Middle East because of a crime that was committed against us before this country was established.
Which is what Obama said when he came to Cairo.
Exactly, and that was and that's the impression that we give, and it's not just from what we hear from Obama, but a lot of people make a legitimate point. Okay, even Ahmadinejad. I mean, I view him as a major enemy of our people, but he's proffered the question: if the Germans committed this crime against the Jews, then why don't they give part of their country to the Jewish people? Why do you have to punish the Palestinians? They had nothing to... Well, actually, that's actually not true. I actually think that's... I don't think it's relevant, but I think it's important that we understand that there were Palestinian Muslims, specifically Haj Amin al-Husseini, who were involved in committing a crime against us in Europe during World War II. He led Bosnian Muslim SS units, right. So that's pretty clear. But I don't think that's very relevant. But it does make a point. Like, why do you, if the Nazis were mainly behind that, why do you have to punish people in another completely different continent who were primarily not really involved in that?
And if you're starting from the premise that Jews are a bunch of Europeans
with
the Jewish religion, then it makes sense.
That's right.
That line of argument makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
Not just to Ahmadinejad, but to Helen Thomas. You say that the Holocaust is isolated in history, or is it merely another in a long line of derivatives that resulted from a primary crime of the Romans expelling us from our country?
It's another one of
just in higher concentration.
Yeah, I mean, if we really think about it, the Holocaust was nothing new. I mean, it just so happened, the reason why the figure was 6 million was because there were so many more Jews in the 20th century in Europe. But, we've had,
Well, I think it was more systematic.
It was more systematic, but, I mean, we had the Crusades, we had, other massacres in Ukraine where hundreds of thousands of us have died before the Holocaust, so many, the Russian pogroms. So many of the Holocaust, I think, was the ultimate, and it looks in our history, in our national history, to be the end of any major national catastrophes against us. But I think that it's just another one of probably a final in the series of horrible events that happened to us as a result of a crime committed against us by the Romans 2,000 years ago.
Now, do you think that, and this is not just for everybody, do people here believe that there were, do you think that the Holocaust provided many of us who did not possess a strong national consciousness beforehand with a very shallow national consciousness that has actually impacted Israeli identity until today? Meaning, is there an Israeli identity or an Israeli nationalism that exists today that's shallow as a result of this kind of anecdotal Jewish nationalism that resulted from the Shoah. Meaning people who would have never made Aliyah if there was not a Shoah, immediately after getting out of the camps, said we have one place to go and one place only, Palestine. And to a lot of Israelis today, that is what this nationalism is all about.
We need to choose our terminology very carefully, make it clear that this is not just a crime against a religion, it's not just about religious persecution, it's about a crime against a people.
Which the Nazis clearly said it was. There are Jews who are afraid to adopt the Nazi terminology. They think that if you relate to the Jewish people, as a race, or as a nation, and out of those three terms, I think people is the most accurate term, then we're, acknowledging that there's some kind of truth to what Hitler said.
Which is, I don't know if anyone in this room has read Mein Kampf.
It's on my list.
Should. Well, it's on your list. It definitely should be read. I've heard people say, no, it's lunatic, drivel. The reality is it's not. There are things there that are maybe obviously offensive and wrong and so forth. But there are a lot of things there. If I wanted to know who felt the soul of Europe in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, were it those professors who supported the Weimar Republic, who wrote their books, wrote their theses, and gave speeches, across the universities across Europe. Did they understand Europe, or did this failed artist who was working in the streets of Austria and Germany, who was able to change the face of Europe, to gather up the energies of all of the Europeans, and basically change the face of humanity as we know it? Who was it that understood the underlying forces driving the European psyche? And for me, it's clear that Adolf Hitler, understood the Europeans,
and
not the professors. He embodied it. He embodied something very real. And if we ignore it and we discount it, then we're ignoring part of the reality of Western civilization. Because he represented a part of Western civilization, and one of the things, like Yuda started saying, that's what turned me on to the idea, is one of the problems I find with a lot of people who portray the Holocaust, and I also actually worked at Yad Vashem for a couple of years, I used to guide there, is the Jew as the scapegoat. Why did the Germans hate the Jews? No reason. They needed a scapegoat. The economy was falling, they needed a scapegoat. There were no real underlying reasons. But if you read in Mein Kampf, and it's true there are things that are contradictory and there are things that are that, but there were a real sense, for real or not, of threat to European society, to European culture, to Western culture, coming from Jewish civilization. What they identified as Jewish civilization. In other words, what was the war when you read Mein Kampf in the mind of Hitler, who was obviously the one who understood European psyche? What do we see there? The war was a war against the Jews. That's what they tell you also, like even at the end of the war when the Russians were advancing and Hitler continued to have trains bring Jews from Greece
at the expense of them
going to the Eastern Front. War against the Jews. That's the way that this was built. A war against the Jews. Why was there a war against the Jews? It wasn't only as a scapegoat. I think it's a very shallow, superficial way to look at it. The war was a clash of civilizations. In other words, there was something in European civilization that said the Jews are a threat, not a fake threat, not a pretend threat, a real threat. And what we're afraid to admit, and I think this is our failure, is that he's right.
So, in relation to how you presented this at Yad Vashem,
yeah,
where does that fit in, or did you just kind of skip it?
Yeah, could you a little, I guess for the sake of everybody understand, like, what do you mean? How are we a threat? How were we a threat to Western society back then?
I think it's the second part of what he's going to say. He must explain what is the difference.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. I don't want to go too far back, but I think one of the things that we can notice, for example, one of the sources of Nazi ideology, even though he himself was not, I don't know that he espoused Nazi ideology, I mean, it was before it, was Friedrich Nietzsche, who died in the year 1900, very important nihilistic philosopher, who was basically the natural outgrowth of Western philosophy. Is this what we want to... was the natural outgrowth of Western philosophy after Western philosophy tried to find truth and found that we cannot substantiate truth in any way. Finally, we get to a philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant, who says, okay, well, we can't know anything about the world as it is, but what I can know is about how I perceive the world, and that was good enough for a little while. And then Nietzsche said, after Schopenhauer, another philosopher came before him, German philosopher came before him, he said, no, you know what? If that's the case, then this is all just a big game. The entire story of there being morality, of there being some kind of external or absolute morality, is a falsehood. And you know who invented it? It was invented by the Jews, adopted by the Christians, and brought to Europe in order to suppress who? The people who should naturally be the heads. And who are they? The strong, beautiful, powerful, intelligent. In other words, what was this great patent that was invented, this startup that was invented? It's something called mercy. What does mercy do? Mercy makes the slave into the master. In the survival of the fittest, when there are lions and there's rabbits, the lion eats the rabbit. And that's the way nature goes, and that's the way that man too should be. And then came along a smart rabbit who was a slave in Egypt and came out and created a type of mental illusion, construct, which convinced the lion that the lion should act like a rabbit so that the rabbit could now be the master. And that was the way that Nietzsche viewed, by the way, that's the way he viewed Christian morality, and I think that is an accurate depiction of Christian morality. I don't think that's an accurate depiction of Jewish morality. I think that's a distortion of Jewish morality that ended up becoming Christian. And in fact, Nietzsche himself, even in several places, he praises the Jewish God as he understood it, and he says that one day this Jewish God will come back, even. But Nietzsche came and said, morality, it's a social construct created by the weak so that they can gain the upper hand upon the powerful. And I have a will to power, and I'm going to throw this out the window, and now I am the source of morality. And what I desire, that is what's moral. Okay, so for example, that's one example. I think there's other examples as well, but about where the Jewish ideas, okay, and Jewish civilization came into conflict. There are many different places we could go.
Can I take this on a tangent? I just have a question. Because I know that, for example, like Dr. Yisrael Eldad also is very much a student of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Do you see a difference between his interpretation and the Nazi interpretation of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche?
Absolutely. The difference is that Nietzsche's motto, and there's made a book, it's called Will to Power, right? The desire to have power. Okay? In other words, that you have to, who you are deep inside, that piece of you inside has to come and express itself. And that's what happened, in a sense, in Nazi Germany. The question is our inner self, is our inner force that same inner force?
So the inner force of Germany was the Shoah.
And at that point in time in history, apparently it was. I mean, that's what came to the fore. And the accusation, this is what Eliyahu, I think, was referring to, is that the world is afraid of this. The world is afraid of this idea that there could be nationalisms, that there could be particularism, that there can be groups that have ideas and ideals, and that these ideas can lead to these great destruction. Why? Because they have, historically. And they're very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, just to add,
Is that what you were referring to?
100%. Can I add one more part of it? It's like, I mean, something that you sort of touch on, Yuda, is about, seeing a small Torah, and, from 2,000 years of exile, Jews have an idea of narrow nationalism, but don't have the broader mission, obviously, because there's nowhere to materialize a broader mission, right? And so they don't understand the beauty of a nationalism that's particular in order to be universal, which is, the whole idea of the Jewish mission. It's not some sort of, organized tribal warfare. It's not some sort of,
But it can be when necessary.
Sure.
But that's not the mission.
Sure. But the ultimate purpose is to bring about, a sort of, just to bring about the vision of the prophets. It's not to, not to have one country take over the world. But I think they're missing that because, they didn't have the opportunity to get in touch with it, we could say.
Who? We? Am Yisrael?
Jewish people who were
Yes.
sort of afraid of being particular.
Who are afraid of nationalism. So there's a phobia of nationalism.
I think it changed from time to time, especially after our failed revolutions against Rome. Well, we know everyone who just opens the Tanakh randomly, he sees like the Jews committing a sin, then God sends the enemy, and then we just slaughter massively the enemy completely, like they're taking down cities, burning, killing. We know in huge numbers. We're doing that because that's how the world is. That's how the warfare is conducted. So I think that in the medieval times, that the rabbis, the Jews generally don't have a country, they don't have an army, they don't have anything, they don't have a sword. I think that from time to time people will start, changing the whole idea from actually fighting to fighting an enemy in spiritual way only. So, for example, the Mashiach, who the Rambam clearly writes that he's going to be a king of Israel, he's going to wage war against the enemies. In the end of the day, we see the Chabadnik who changed it, that he was going to be a rabbi, and the people that would just follow him because he's a rabbi.
And now he's
because he's a rabbi, he's dead.
Now he's Santa Claus.
Yeah.
The concept of Mashiach is basically the Jewish Santa Claus. In the Haredi world.
Yeah, that's the truth. It's just like they're just very far away from the ancient interpretation. The medieval interpretation is a bit far away.
From a warrior king to...
From the warrior king of the warrior nation, which pretty much that's what it means. I mean, when we went out from Egypt, we didn't go out with books, we went out armed.
I think that this has to be a part of our narrative, and it's not a part of our narrative today. In other words, the idea, when we remember the Shoah, we remember the Holocaust, we have to remember the idea that we weren't only innocent, persecuted, scapegoat, weaklings.
Representing a challenging...
We were representing our civilization, challenged Europe, and maybe not such a nice way. And that, for me, is the story of...
did we start the fight?
Did
we smash their idols?
We absolutely, well, let's say definitely from the point of view of Mein Kampf, we smashed their idols, and that, for example, like I said, there's many contradictions in Mein Kampf. One of the contradictions is that the Jews are responsible for communism, and therefore we must fight the Jews, and the Jews are responsible for capitalism, and therefore we must fight the Jews. Well, but that's true, and that's what's insane, and people want to discount that, but that is absolutely true. And, for example, one of the other arguments that it makes there is that the Jews are responsible for the corruption of European art and European music. While we know that there were many Jews who, even, for example, Mendelssohn, for example, who saw themselves as Germans to the full extent and created German music. But there were also phenomenon of non-German elements, international elements, very liberal elements inside of Europe that they could be traced readily to the Jewish populations for whatever reasons, if those are authentic Jewish things or those are marginal Jewish elements, just from the fact that the Jews are a universal people and we collect ideas and make connections throughout the entire world. We were the internet before there was the internet.
It's the other way around, though, I think.
What?
That
we're the synthesis that predates the thesis and the antithesis.
Right, that the Torah is a tamtzit. It's the Torah captures all of these different truths, and like
then distill out afterwards.
Right, and it's sort of a mystical concept where you say Am Yisrael Kut Shabrichu V'Oraita Chadem. Right, you say that God, the Jewish people, and the Torah are one, and we're a reflection of the Torah, and the Torah is this broad truth of all this knowledge, and the Jewish people are a collection of all the world's talents. And so, I mean, if we're looking at it from a strictly scientific, physical, materialist perspective, right, we were in all these places and we picked up all of this culture and we mixed with all these people, but it's all a realization of our inner identity.
We're the kaleidoscope.
You're 100% right, but let me give you a suggestion in general about this. There are two ways we can look at these issues. We can look at them from the sociological, materialistic, secular perspective, and come to the conclusion that these are the conclusions of the Torah. Or we can come from the position of the Torah and say, and then come to reality. Those are two different directions. And my suggestion, I think that it's more effective today to try to come from the outside and come to the conclusion of the Torah.
I think it's really important that you do it the other way around, and I'll explain to you why. Maybe it makes sense in the context of where we are today at this sort of junction in Jewish history and of modern, the history of the state of Israel also, where we're looking at all these concepts, right? We're looking at things that are ostensibly foreign to us, right? We're seeing things, and right, like we're seeing things like pluralism, right? Like a magnified value of the individual, like a capitalist society in Israel, and we're saying that these are all things, right? And we're having to try and reconcile what is a Jewish economic model, right? What is a Jewish societal model? How does a Jewish legal system look? Are these our values? And if you say that we're starting from a broad perspective and then coming in, you're making it seem like we're it makes a difference. It's about whether
we're trying to make the Torah match our conclusions.
Right. Did we learn all this information from everyone else and then we're getting to the Torah? Or is the Torah the machshavat tchila? Is the Torah the first and original starting point? That's the question. And I think for the, it's important to our narrative, and it's important, in terms of representing the truth, that we, present it this way to the outside.
By definition, the Torah is what's called, tonight is already, it's like we're the first in Tzfat HaOmer, we're in the Midah of Tiferet, which is the harmony between all the different parts. In other words, everything, there's no man that doesn't have an hour, and there's no thing that has no place. Everything has a place, and everything has an hour. The problem is putting everything in the right position, and in the right sequence, and in the right hierarchy, and the right arrangement. And that's the idea of Tiferet. That's what the Torah teaches us to do. That's what these ideas all exist.
Yes,
now, what's the correct place?
So maybe I just want to clarify one thing that maybe I didn't say clearly enough, is that in all these cultures, right, you say there are ideas in the world that aren't Jewish ideas. What I'm trying to say is that each culture that leads, each culture that is, and ideas that cause sweeping movements of millions of people have a point of truth in them, right?
Right.
Not necessarily saying that the entire.
That's why they exist.
Not that the entire shita is Torah. Not that the entire shita is a Jewish truth, but that there is a point that there is an element of truth that is found in our treasure box.
That's what's called the Atem Kuim Adam, Beinu Moto Olam Kuim Adam. That saying in other words, the idea that man's identity was divided into 70 parts and dispersed among 70 different nations, and each one of them is like a part of the puzzle. But Israel is ideally the 71st nation. In other words, that it retains the original identity of man, and our purpose here is really, and that's the universal purpose of Israel, is to put those pieces back together in a proper sequence.
There's so many dangers there, though. Can you say that the Shoah, the organized mass killing concentration camps, is something that the Jew can also do? Because it's one of the traits of one of the nations.
No, we're not saying that we have all of the traits of every other nation. I'm saying there's an element of goodness, there's an element of truth found in every culture and every nation, and we as the kaleidoscope of nations have that within us. Right? Now, in terms of what you said before, the suggestion I'd make is to differentiate between like the small Torah and the big Torah. And if you're coming from the starting point of the big Torah, it doesn't matter whether you start from the small Torah within or secular wisdom within, because it's all Torah. If you're looking at all of it through the lens of God's truth, if you're looking at all through the lens of the big Torah, then there's nothing enod milvado. There's nothing outside and there's nothing threatening. There's no foreign wisdom. And by the way, you have to be there. Because I think for a lot of people, university could be dangerous, damaging to emunah. I think there's certain yeshivot I wouldn't feel comfortable sending my kids to because they're too academic and too westernized. But I think if you are confident and secure and you feel you have your Torah is a big Torah, a Torah of life, then that Torah is not easily challenged. And it's okay to start from a materialist or a sociological perspective and you work your way towards the small Torah within the big Torah because it's all Torah.
All of Europe has this one psyche, and the Jewish psyche is not corresponding with
It's not
it.
fitting in. Yeah.
So I think
Europe
this is.
or is it Germany?
What's that? I remember
Europe,
he said it in the broader context of all of Europe. But so like you say, all the goyim are looking at it from this certain perspective. It's our responsibility to be true to ourselves, and not in a superficial way, but because it's a matter of truth. That's what.
There's a story of Menachem Begin in prison with two Poles, right, in the Russian gulag. And one of the Poles says to his cellmates, another Pole in Begin, soon the Germans will be here and we'll be free. And Begin right away, Chas v'shalom, right? Like, God forbid. If the Germans come here, they'll round up all the Jews and kill them. And the Poles look at each other and they say, to Begin, they say, until now, we haven't believed, we didn't really believe this anti-Semitic accusation that Jews only care about Jews, that Jews are primarily concerned with their own people. Here you are in a cell with us, we're your cellmates, we're suffering together, and we're thinking about how to get free, how to alleviate our own distress, and all you care about are your fellow Jews. Now I realize that those accusations were true. That's what you guys are like. That's what you Jews are like. And Begin goes to the wall, and he says to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, he says, what are they accusing me of? They're accusing me of Jewish solidarity. What have my people done to prove there's no such thing as Jewish solidarity? In the Napoleonic Wars, Jews killed Jews. In World War I, Jews killed Jews. I beg you, turn this anti-Semitic accusation into a Jewish reality. Meaning that sometimes the secret of our redemption can be found in the accusations of our enemies.
That it reminds me of a metaphor that I read not too long ago in Parasuram, actually writes about it. He said, what we have today, the resulting nationalism that resulted from the Holocaust and from persecution, from discrimination and things like that, is like a bunch of walnuts.
The Jewish nationalism.
The Jewish nationalism is like a bunch of walnuts that are in a bag. We're together because there's some external force that's holding us together, but the minute that the sack falls and it's opened up, the walnuts each roll off in their own direction. And what we have to do is we have to find the way to find our solidarity not like that. In other words,
pour glue into the bag.
Pour glue into the bag, exactly. And we have to do it before the bag opens up and we start to fall out. But that's the secret to I think where we are right now in the transition that we have to make, and it comes up in a lot of different ways. In the death of the old type of Zionism and the birth of the new, the continuation of the revolution, how we want to go forward. One of the secrets now is what is holding us together. What's that glue that's going to hold us together? What's that flag that's going to hold us together? Like there was the Mishkan and the Midbar, that all the tribes, there would be different tribes. They're all different, and we have to realize also, and I think this is what's so difficult about it, is that the Jewish people are so different within ourselves because we're a reflection of humanity, like the things we were talking about before. Because we're the inclusive of all the 70 nations within us, we also have to be able to find the place within us to realize how each of these different sectors plays a role, a special role, and is an organ in this greater body that's the people of Israel.
I want to say something really pretty, a little bit, I don't want to say far-fetched, but, to add on to what Yehuda said, that sometimes, our enemies are the secrets to our path to success, and redemption is found in sometimes what our enemies tell us. And I brought this up with Gabe a little bit earlier, that sometimes the neo-Nazis today, they'll shout out to Jews and they'll tell them to go back to Israel. And on the face of it, we see this as like that's a horrific thing to say. You hate Jews and you want them out of the, but like in a sense, it's actually like a message to us. This is where we belong, and we don't belong in their countries. We actually belong here.